Africa's such a weird little song because no one thought that would be a hit. They weren't
Right.
even going to record that song. It
The
was
very
the
last
last
track,
song we
just throw it at the end and
do it at the end. Never thought it'd be a hit.
hey Preston, welcome to the podcast. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Eric. It's good to be here, man.
Well, I was telling you before we started recording that you've got me into one Toto song that I never knew about, which I now love, and one that I forgot about, which I love all over again. So we're gonna get to all of this. Let's talk about when you became a fan. Your first Toto concert, according to the book, 1999. And that's the same year you got into Toto. Is that the case? How did
That's
you become
not,
a fan?
that's kind of it. I mean,
Okay.
my first concert was in 1999. That was out inside Philadelphia, actually. I think back then I was living in a small town in Maryland near the Delaware, no, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania border and went up to see the band. But actually, and I don't know if I kind of alluded to this in the book. I got into Toto when I was at WestConn, Western Connecticut State University in Danbury. My roommate was a drummer, and he was a big fan of Genesis. He loved Phil Collins drumming. Big fan of Weather Report, so he really was a Chester Thompson fan, and he was a big fan of Jeff Porcaro, who was the original drummer for the band Toto. So he got me into the band.
Okay. So is there a story behind why you chose the book title? I love the title, Toto the band, not the dog.
Oh man, yeah. I was thinking about titles, and it was about a year ago. I was in New York with some friends who live in Illinois, and we get together occasionally. We go to some shows, and my concert buddy Joe was talking about the book, and Joe said, "Well, what you need is a title, but you don't want to get people confused. So what about Toto, the band, not the dog?" And I thought, well, that's a stupid damn title. I'll use it.
It gets your attention, that's for sure.
Yeah, so that's what I use. But yeah, it came from my buddy Joe, my concert buddy Joe's actually been to a few Toto concerts with me.
Now, and there's a meaning behind the word Toto, which I didn't know. That it means something. Is that in the book? I think.
And it's not in the book.
No.
I don't know. I mean, there are obviously people who've traveled the world, especially who've been to Asia and specifically Japan, know that Toto is the name of a plumbing company. So
Okay.
if you've ever been to Japan, one of their biggest, I think one of their biggest commode sellers is the Toto brand. But I think that the band really got its name from the character of Wizard of Oz, the dog Toto.
Okay.
Now, I didn't mention this in the book, but the OTOT was also their partnership brand, backwards Toto, where they had a membership sharing agreement with regard to royalties when the band started. So that may have something to do with it too, but
Okay.
that's my understanding of the name.
Yeah, because I thought I read something was like a Latin term for like complete or whole, which would
Oh,
make
that's right. It
sense.
is. You're right.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that might
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
where it's
Yeah.
coming from as well. So
Mhm.
before we get into the discography, can you just give us the brief when, where, and how the band formed?
Okay. So the band was formed pretty much after the Boz Scaggs Silk Degrees album. Now, Jeff Porcaro, the original drummer and co-founder, and David Page had done a lot of session work throughout LA, and they worked with a number of different producers, and they were getting a lot of feedback that, hey, maybe you guys should join a band, start a band. So Jeff Porcaro reached out to David, and they were doing a lot of sessions together and said, yeah, let's start a band. Let's bring in some of the players that we know. And they wanted to bring in a guitarist. And I think they brought in a guitarist from the band. I think it was Still Life, which was a band that Steve Porcaro had in high school, working with a number of guitarists and eventually Steve Lukather. I think that's how it worked out. So they brought in Steve Lukather, who was about 2 years younger than Page or Porcaro. They also decided that they wanted the original bass player on the Silk Degree sessions. So even though Mike Porcaro was a accomplished bass player at the time and started doing sessions, they decided to bring in David Hungate, who had mountains of session experience, and the record company knew who he was. So they brought in Hungate instead of Mike Porcaro. And of course, as a lot of people know, Hungate left after Toto 4. Mike Porcaro came in the band.
Okay.
They also decided to bring in their brother, Steve Porcaro. So you had the three brothers, Jeff being the oldest, Mike the middle brother, and Steve the youngest. And Steve was a synthesizer whiz. He had worked with Boz Scaggs also, but also worked with Gary Wright during, I think it was his Dreamweaver tour, his big tour. And Steve Porcaro has a number of credits under his title, under his name as well. So you had the three brothers, you had Steve Lukather, and they decided they needed a singer, another singer, even though Page and Steve Lukather sang. So they decided to reach out to another person they heard about, which was Bobby Kimball. And Kimball's also a little bit older than the other guys. He was our original lead singer through Toto 4, and then he came back after a few years for their album Falling in Between.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting that he came back and then he left again, and the same with Joseph Williams. So there's an interesting storyline in terms of the lead singers and a
Yeah.
great connection to one of the, if not the greatest movie soundtrack artists of all time. We'll get to that too. The
Yeah.
self-titled debut album, released October of 1978, reached number 9, and they have 4 singles: Hold the Line, I'll Supply the Love, Georgie Porgy, and Rockmaker. And as you note in the book, Hold the Line is the song that they've played the most in concert.
Right.
And that's their first top 10 single, reached number 5. Now, you write about why this David Page composition is so enduring in the book. It's deceptively simple. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Page's piano on Hold the Line is really it seems unusually simple considering how the album has elements of prog, elements of jazz, and of course elements of pop in it. But he has this really quick, I guess, staccato kind of piano feel to it. But what you may not hear in the first listen is all that's going on in the background. Not only Page's obvious piano playing, but the synthesizer touches that Steve Porcaro adds, the swirling synthesizers, then you have a pretty driving backbeat. And I don't think, I mean, Hungate is pretty straightforward in his playing on this album, on his song rather. And then you have a really um, I guess behind the beat feel from Jeff Porcaro, which makes the song. Um, David Page was, like I mentioned, a stellar at the time, and still is a stellar session player, but his style is a little bit different than a lot of session players at that time. I mean, one guy that comes to mind in terms of his piano work is David Foster, who, as you know, is the guy around a lot of big hits. Some of the most popular songs David Foster has either written or been involved in, and of course won multiple Grammys with the group Chicago. Foster's rhythmic playing on piano is a little bit different than Page's, and it's also a little bit more elaborate. But yeah, Page I think really holds it together in that song, and it gives it a really good feel.
And he's got the signature look. He's the guy with the big top hat, or is it a top hat he's
Yes,
wearing?
yes, the
Yes.
top hat.
Yeah. And this is funny because I Georgie Porgy, the first time I've ever heard that song is in the MC Light song. She sampled it for what was it? I think the song had George in the title. It must be in online here somewhere. But the
Yeah,
funny thing is I had no idea it was Toto
really.
until many years later. I said, "Oh my God, okay, yeah, Georgie Porgy, boy." I don't see it in the Wikipedia entry here, but yeah. Anyway, MC Light, yeah.
And the thing
um,
is, I mean, that song has been covered by a lot of people.
has it really?
I
Okay.
see when I think of Georgie Porgy, I think first about the version that Cheryl Lynn did, and I believe that was produced by David Page. He produced her first album, and that was her first hit. And the version that she does is very similar to Toto's because probably Page was involved with it. So yeah, there've been a number of covers around Georgie Porgy, which is interesting because I mean lyrically it's not the strongest song that Toto has done, but it's a great feel to it. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's real popular on Spotify. I think it's number 5 on Spotify.
Get out of here, really?
Yeah, yeah, it's a way up there. And by the way, it's Poor Georgie, 1991, MC Light. There
Oh
you
wow.
go. There you go. So obviously, Hold the Line's the huge hit, but do you have like you have an underdog track from the first album? And by
Right.
the way, you do that in the book, which is cool. Your favorite track from each album. That's very cool.
Yeah, I don't know if I pulled out the most popular songs. And there are a few deep cuts that I do talk about as my favorite songs. And I think for the Toto debut album, it was Child's Anthem, which no,
Taking it back. I'm looking
Taking
at it
It
here.
Back,
Taking it back.
which is Steve Porcaro's song. I think it is the only song he wrote on the album. And Steve Porcaro doesn't have that many writing credits with Toto. He doesn't write on every album, but that was I just love the feel for that song. I love the bass part that Hungate plays. It's so funky. And again, Jeff Porcaro slightly behind the beat. The feel and the synth parts are great as well.
And you say it's difficult to believe, but keyboardist Steve Porcaro has made only 3 official vocal contributions to the Toto catalog. But it
Right.
is impressive, though, how many different members of the band can sing.
Yeah, it is, but they have some well, it was late 70s that you're going into the 80s where you have this era of tenor rock singers. I mean, you have people like Steve Perry, who I think Perry was what, the third lead singer for Journey?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Brad Delp,
but
Lou Graham,
yeah, Brad
right?
Delp. Oh
Yeah,
my God, yes, yes. Yeah, people who were singing way up there. Mickey
yep.
Thomas, yeah, from
From
Jefferson Starship.
Starship.
So you had those people who are, and Geddy Lee, if you talk about prog rock from Rush, you have a bunch of singers who are singing real high. They thought, the record company especially thought, hey, you need a guy who could be your front man who could sing nice and high. And I don't know if, I think maybe Steve Porcaro or maybe Steve Lukather mentioned that if they had known back then they'd be around long enough and these guys would have to sing that way in their 60s and
Yeah.
70s, they never would have written songs like that because it's just hard to sing. But back then, Kimball could do it.
So true. I'm going to see Sammy Hagar next week, and he does not include Dreams in the set list anymore. He's like, he laughed. Somebody was asking him if he could still do it. He's like, "What are you kidding me, man? You want to kill me?" I ain't doing that one. But it's true, yeah. That you never think about it that far ahead.
Right.
But boy, the those songs like Hold the Line and Africa and Rosanna, I mean, they just stand the test of time. And so it's obviously important that they did write those. And I think they will live long past us. They're just classics. And Total 4 is the album where that's the album that really shoots the band to stardom. But between that self-titled debut and the fourth album, we have 1979's Hydra and
Extra.
1981's Turn Back. Neither
Yeah.
matched the success of that first album, although there was the top 30 single 99 from Hydra, which is a great tune. But you say Hydra has aged really well with time. What are your thoughts on those 2 albums? Why were they unable to match that success of the debut? Were they rushing to get that second album out?
I think that they had a good well of songs for Hydra. Page had some songs left. And then you saw with Hydra, the first kernel of Steve Lukather's writing. I mean, he didn't write anything for the first album, I believe. And I think he got a co-writing credit on Hydra, on the song Hydra, and they all did. But my understanding about that song Hydra is that actually it was mostly David Page, but they wanted to make sure they were including everyone in the royalties. And that goes back to also how they had their corporation set up. But what the difference was that I think you saw a lot more involvement and more confidence in terms of the writing process, the band coming, the other members, especially Lukather, Steve Lukather, coming up with some great riffs and then some complete songs, which was the difference between the first album and Toto 4. Another piece, though, so they had songs. but they also wanted to not kind of recreate what they did with the first album. They wanted to really show who they were. And I think Hydra is a really weird album because it starts off as a prog album. The song Hydra is a prog song. It has all the great prog elements you want, the fantastic synth washes, the great piano parts, some really driving drums, innovative bass playing, and a fantastic guitar solo and leads by Steve Lukather. And then you have the next song, St. George and the Dragon, which is a great rock song.
That's
Uh,
your favorite from that album.
it really is. It's a great, straight ahead, four on the floor rock song. Again, Page's really rhythmic pianos. So you have the prog elements, then you have a song like 99, which is kind of funky, kind of mystical, kind of whimsical, um, and has lyrics which make no sense unless you know the story about the song 99. The album goes on, you have some songs which just don't fit into any specific or the genre which was already established with the first three songs, like Rain, All Us Boys, and the Mama, which is a funk song. So how these different pieces which didn't really work together and are hard to market to a mass audience. They had some minor hits, but it wasn't a huge hit like the first album.
The titles are very prog, like St. George and the Dragon is
The Dragon.
proggy. What is 99 about?
99 is about a society where people are reduced to numbers, not a true identity. At the time, it was a futuristic look at how we all would be reduced to numbers as opposed to individuals. And kind of a prelude to the internet and having different identities.
Yeah, who was the main lyricist for Toto? Was it one guy, Kimball, writing those early album
No,
tracks?
no.
No,
Most of the lyrics for the first four albums were David Page.
David. Okay.
And even if he didn't sing it, and I think, well, he didn't, I think he sang maybe two songs on Hydra, maybe two or three songs. But even if he didn't sing it, he did the majority of the lyrics. And the one thing, and I talked to Page, I think it was the year before last, when his solo album came out, and included part of that in the book as well. One thing they were constantly trying to focus on was their lyrics. They wanted to have more direct lyrics, more relatable lyrics. And he was always being pushed by the rest of the band members to do that. And they became better lyricists. And then they also brought in some outside lyricists later on in their careers, such as Randy Goodrum, Stan Lynch, who was a drummer for Tom Petty and the
Yeah.
Heartbreakers, a bunch of different people to help him with lyrics. Michael Sherwood, who I gave a special thanks to in the book as well.
St. George and the Dragon is about what?
I think it's if I don't know the story of Saint George and the Dragon. I mean, in terms of, I know it's a mythical, it has a mythical, mystic story to it, and the song really is about this Hydra that has an impact on the main character. But what it's about, I have no idea.
Hmm. Yeah, people can try to figure that out. Read the lyrics. Yeah, Toto 4
Yeah.
was released April 8th, 1982. Number 4 on Billboard. Rosanna peaks at number 2 for 5 weeks. Africa goes to number 1. I Won't Hold You Back, number 10. The album earned 3 Grammys, including Album of the Year. What made this album work so well and connect with so many people, in your opinion? Is it just what you talked about? The lyrics maybe a little more direct, the songs crafted a little bit more towards a mainstream audience?
Yeah, good question. I think Total 4 was a left turn from the prior album, which was Turn Back. Turn Back, they wanted to write a rock album, a guitar album. So they had some great rock riffs. They did struggle, I thought, a little bit with Turn Back in terms of the lyrics, but more importantly, I thought the production for Turn Back was not up to the usual Toto standards. Weird thing about Toto is their first album out of the gate, they were allowed to produce their own album. Second album, they produced their own album. third album, they brought in was it Jeff Workman, I believe,
Yeah.
the who worked with a number of prog artists, and then had a really good reputation for his work. But the album was a lot more direct, a lot more stripped than the prior two albums, a lot more guitar driven than the prior two albums, a lot less synths than the prior two albums. When Turn Back wasn't a big hit, the band knew that they had to produce for the fourth album. They had either to have an album which would sell well, or they would probably be released from the record contract with Columbia Records. So they were very focused on having the best songs, and also the best production. They produced Toto 4 themselves. They did bring in a few studio musician friends with them, most notably Timothy B. Schmidt, who was with Poco, and of course at that time had just left the Eagles in 1982 or so. Well, 1980, the Eagles ended the first run anyway. So Timothy B. Schmidt, they brought in Ralph Dykes on keyboards, on synthesizers to help out, James Newton Howard on string arrangements, and the Martin Ford Orchestra. And then they brought in the Toto horns, which are a combination of Jerry Hay, who's a trumpet player and arranger, and the great James Pankow, who is the trombonist and arranger for Chicago. So all those elements together, and they had a fantastic album. And then they had good songs.
Yeah, man. Really good songs. How about your personal pick from that album? I can
Oh, so that's
look for it
I,
here.
I just said when we started, I didn't really usually pick the popular song, but I think my favorite was Rosanna. And that's because, and that's a David Page solo composition. He wrote it
Yeah.
himself.
Yeah, a
Um,
great Led Zeppelin and Steely Dan connection you make
yes,
mention
yes,
of.
that drum part, and the whole John Bottom kind of feel, and Bernard Purdy, John Bottom feel to the drums, that shuffle. And then
Fool in the Rain. They got that was from Fool in the
yes,
Rain, right?
Fool in the Rain from
Yeah.
Into the Outdoor. That's a great
Yeah.
feel for that. Yeah. And then you have a really great orchestrated keyboard parts. You have Page's piano playing and solo. You have Steve Porcaro's piano playing and his solos. And then you have these two fantastic solos by Steve Lukather, which again bring up a little bit David Gilmour, um, a little Brian May in there, and it all worked. And then you had a video, their biggest video probably. Well, maybe Africa, but the second biggest video. Yeah, so it all worked. The song's perfect.
Yeah, and the other Steely Dan song you mentioned is Babylon Sisters. There's a connection to
Yes,
that song. Weren't some of the guys, didn't they work in the studio for Steely Dan? Yeah,
absolutely.
there's a Steely Dan
So
connection there.
yeah, Page was called in to do the Pretzel Logic album. That was the first album where Steely Dan kind of relied heavily on session players, even though the core band still existed. And at those sessions for Pretzel Logic, Page was working, doing piano and keyboards. He brought along his friend, Jeff Porcaro. So Jeff sat into those few sessions. Actually, I have that backwards. Strike that. It was Porcaro who was brought in
Okay.
from by Denny Diaz, who was Steely Dan's guitarist, and Page hung out and he played on a few songs as well. So you had that connection there. And then the following album after Pretzel Logic, which is Katie Lied, you have Jeff Porcaro playing all the drums except for one track, and you have Page contributing, I think, to three or four tracks in terms of keyboards. If you flash ahead a few years from Katie Lie to their big selling Asia, which was 1977, um, Steely Dan thought they hadn't toured since 74. They thought they'd tour again in 77, 78. They started rehearsing a band and they needed a guitarist. They had Walter Becker, Steely Dan founding member, playing bass. I think they had Denny Diaz on guitar. They needed another guitarist, and they reached out to Steve Lukather, and they set up practices, but they never went through with the tour, so they ended that. But there was always that connection.
Well, and it just tells you how talented the band is because Steely Dan, those guys, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen, they chose the best of the best in the studio and on the road. and that tells you a lot. And I never really picked up on that. There's a Steely Dan vibe to those Toto songs too, and now I know why.
Oh,
Africa,
absolutely.
yeah, Africa. Last song on Toto 4 represents an end in many respects for the band. That's what you write. Talk about that.
Africa's such a weird little song because if you talk to David Page, and I think I asked him about this maybe, and I put that in the book. And I know Steve Lukather talked about it when I met with him. No one thought that would be a hit. They
Right.
weren't even going to record that song. It
The
was
very
the
last
last
track,
song,
just throw it at the end, and
do it at the end. Never thought it'd be a hit. Didn't think it would come out. The record company chose the singles. They didn't think it would come out. It is a David Page composition, mostly with Jeff Porcaro providing. We think he contributed to the music. Specifically, it is a drum. It's not. I guess it's a loop. It's a tape loop that he plays over, which he made. But yeah, no one ever thought that song would be popular. Lyrically, the song, what is Africa about? Don't know. Doesn't make any sense.
yeah, yeah.
I
How do you
bless the
bless
rain,
the
South
rain?
Africa.
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I'm
what the
still
hell does
trying to
that
figure out.
mean? But it has a great feel.
An
You
imagery. It
have
just
again,
creates an image. It's sometimes it may not make sense, but it creates a visual in your mind.
exactly. And then you have a video going along with it, with a band sitting on the floor playing it. The thing I love about Africa also, and I have to say this. I mean, the bass part, the drums are great. The percussion with Lenny Castro and also Joe Porcaro playing the marimba and playing some other percussion instruments with Lenny Castro is fantastic.
Brilliant.
But you
Yeah.
have this fantastic bass part that is stunning. And that was also the last bass part until Toto 14 that David Hungate would play with the band. So you have all these elements. Then you have this wonderful backing vocal by Timothy B. Schmidt and Bobby Kimball, which also works out really well. So it all came together. They never thought it'd be a hit. And what the hell? It's their biggest song ever.
Yeah.
One of the
Steve,
biggest songs.
this is Steve Porcaro. You asked about Africa, and he said, "We never thought of that as a single for a split second. Not one time during the making of that record did anybody in the band Toto think, oh, here's a single, not for 1 nanosecond." And then he goes on to say, the last song, that's where you put the dog of the album. And then he laughed. And yeah, he said, we worked our asses off on it. I know David tried real hard to up his lyric game. We did all of these experiments. Jeff with the loops, me, I did all kinds of weird synthesizer experiments on it. You know that the synth, it's just perfect. Dun, 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 dun. You know that it
It really
just
is perfect.
perfect, perfect. So some lineup changes, notably the lead singer job is now vacant as we get into the second half of the 80s. Talk about that, what you think of the 3 studio albums that closed out the decade. It was
Oh,
Isolation, Fahrenheit, and the seventh one, right?
okay, so here's the weird thing. And I don't think I said which album's my favorite Toto album. I tried to avoid that because
Yeah.
it changes so often. But you're coming up to a situation where they made some of their best music after the original lineup. So you had the exit of David Hungate on bass. Really, the day they recorded Africa, once they finished that, he was out of there. I think someone told me he threw his bass up against the wall. He said, "I'm done." And they didn't know that he had moved to Nashville, became a Nashville session player and a producer. Most notably, if you check out Chet Atkins' album, Please Stay Tuned, Hungate did a fantastic job on Chet Atkins' album because he's worked for a lot of people as a producer. You had a situation where Bobby Kimball was struggling with some chemicals and um, was asked to leave. So he was gone. So you had two of the core members gone. And Toto thought, again, going back to what we talked about in terms of the tenor singer, they wanted someone who could sing nice and high, but they also wanted to change their look, their appearance of videos. They wanted to have a singer who was attractive to women, and yet could
It's the
handle those high
80s.
harmony
It
parts.
is the MTV era. MTV era.
It
Yeah.
is. So they got Fergie Fredrickson, and he was in a band I think called LaRoe or something like that, a hard rock band. and they went in to record Isolation. Now, Isolation had, I think it had a few songs which were recorded by the band before Fergie joined the band. And there was one song which even had vocals from Bobby Kimball, most notably the co-write he got on Lion, Lion, Lion. Um, but yeah, total change. That was a much harder rocking album, more guitar bass. The synth parts were not as elaborate on Isolation. And he didn't work out. Fergie didn't work out because he struggled in the studio singing quickly. They wanted those vocals down quick. Fergie struggled with those, staying in tune. Then he struggled on the road in terms of just being exhausted because they were touring hard. You asked about the other two albums, and we have Isolation. We bring in Joseph Williams, who was the son of John Williams, as you talked
Oh
about.
man, I love that. That's just some great music trivia.
Yeah,
John
it's weird,
Williams,
isn't it?
yeah, yeah,
What a
man.
small musical world.
What I would love to be there during family dinners, right? Talking about music. Jaws, Star Wars, Raiders of the Lost
Yeah.
Ark. I mean, you can just go on and on and on. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Here's a talented family named Mark Williams. Mark T. Williams is a drummer, a composer, writer. He's pretty well known in the session world. It's Joe's brother, older brother, I believe. But yeah, they brought in Joe Williams for two albums, and both albums are very strong. Joseph Williams, a much better writer, in my opinion, than Bobby Kimball, and much better than Fergie. And he contributes some great songs to those albums. But the landscape had changed for the band because you started to see the grunge uh, catching on. You start to see less production in songs, not more production. So it wasn't going to happen for the band. The seventh one is a fantastic album. It is their seventh album. Had some minor hits, but by then their record company, Columbia Records, had gone through some major changes, and they had no support from the label in America. And it had minor hits here, but not big hits. Those days were over.
Well, this is where I want to tell you about the song that was a hit, and I forgot, and I didn't even realize it was Toto, and I love it. It's just beautiful. I'll Be Over You from
I'll be over you.
Fahrenheit from 1986, and that's got Michael McDonald in there. You get to about the 2 minute 5 second mark, and you can't mistake that sound, that vocal sound of Michael McDonald. I
Yeah,
love that song.
I mean, it's a great song,
It
and it
just
was
doesn't sound like Toto, I guess. Maybe it's a little more like um, like 38 Special had a song like that. What's it was a hit single, but it just didn't sound like 38 Special to me. I'm drawing a blank on the name, but anyway, are you a fan of "I'll Be Over You," or was it a little too poppy?
no, I don't. It's a great song. And here's the thing about Toto and their ballads. I mean, who's the guy that sings the ballads? It's not their lead singer usually. It's usually Steve Lukather. Their hard rocking guitarist is the one that they usually go to. I would say 90% of the time to sing the ballads. And he not only sings that, of course, he also co-wrote the song. And it is a wonderful pop song. Has a great backing vocal by Michael McDonald, a standout backing vocal by him, along with Joseph Williams as well. Some great synth parts and a great big drum part as well. Nice orchestrated drum part. Yeah, it's a great song. And Luther has a great
Oh, I
solo
was just
on it.
about to say, great solo on there. Great
Yeah,
solo. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's the 38 Special song that I was referring to. That it's where is it here? Is it Caught Up in? No, not Caught Up in You. It is Second Chance.
I
I
don't know
always
that.
thought, oh, okay, Second Chance is a song that it's just like it didn't sound like 38 Special. So I guess could you say that didn't sound much like a Toto song? Was a little maybe
I think it sounds like a Toto song because they
okay.
had ballads similar to that on all the prior albums. And they released a number of ballads. Almost every song they released with Steve Lukather singing lead is a ballad. They didn't let
Okay.
him, and he sang some hard rock songs
And this is
on the
interesting.
record.
They really had an affinity towards writing songs about women's names, Pamela, Anna. Yeah, but
Ah,
here comes the other one, Preston. Here comes the song that I never even knew about, and it's now among my favorites from Toto, Mushanga.
Shana. Yeah.
Mushanga.
What a weird little song, huh?
Right? But it's really cool, and you really get a feel for that talent, all around talent of the band, the rhythm section, the whole thing, and it's got some great synth work. I love it. So I'm going to put it in the playlist for this episode. People got to hear that one. Mushanga. I don't know what it
Yeah.
means, but I love it.
So doesn't it, but don't you feel it has a little touch of Africa in it? I
Well,
mean, the song Africa.
yes, yeah, that might have been maybe trying to the formula there, but
Right, right,
I
right.
kept thinking, boy, this is a Disney. This would be a Disney film song. That would be perfect, you know. And yeah,
And the thing too, that's a song that David Page wrote with Jeff Porcaro. Like they collaborated with Africa. It has a interesting drum part, which is a touch of Africa, a touch of the Donald Fagen song, the Goodbye Look from his first solo album, which Jeff Porcaro played on. So you have all those pieces together. You already talked about the Fool in the Rain piece. Not as much there, but still, yeah, it's weird.
so we get into the 90s now, and I'm going to tell you, as a big Van Halen fan, there is a specific track on 1992's Kingdom of Desire that stands out. It is the final track, Jake to the Bone.
Take to the bone.
Okay. Alex Van Halen used that song as part of his drum solo during the 2015 tour. So if you go on YouTube, you will hear it in there. And of course, Eddie and Steve Lukather were great friends. So that's
Yeah.
probably the connection there. So there you go. A nice little piece of trivia there. Toto Van Halen trivia. So let's get to those 90s albums. Three of them in the 90s. Kingdom of Desire, 1992. Tambu, 1995, or Tambu, is it my
Bamboo.
pronouncing?
Yeah.
Okay. Tambu, 1995, and 1999's Minefields. And, just as you mentioned, the 90s was tough for any band that came up in the 70s and or 80s because the grunge era just really, took out a lot of those bands. But
Yeah.
Bobby Kimball does return. Before I ask you about that, he comes back in 98 for Minefields. Tell us about the Tambu album. You say, quote, it's a damn near perfect Toto album. And quite frankly, that's a surprise. Who's the lineup on that album? Talk about why you're a fan of that
Okay,
album.
so with Kingdom of Desire, and I know you asked about Tin, but let me get to that. But
Yeah.
Kingdom of Desire was the last album to feature Jeff Porcaro as drummer. They had
Yes.
scheduled a tour, and he had died before the tour.
He was
So
gardening when he died. Isn't that the story?
he was gardening and spreading pesticides and had a massive heart attack.
Oh my God. And he had just appeared on Springsteen's
Yes,
one
Human
of
Touch,
those
right?
Human Touch with Bruce put out Human Touch and Lucky Town, like two individual albums released at the same time. And he was on that album.
Right. So they had a tour scheduled for Europe and a small tour scheduled for America. And that's when we talked about earlier. My first time seeing them was for that tour for Kingdom of Desire. So they needed a drummer, obviously. And this was before Facebook and the internet and all that stuff. So I didn't know who they picked. Apparently, Steve Lukather had worked with this great drummer when he was working with Jeff Beck, because Lukather had produced an album by Jeff Beck, which has not been released as of yet. The drummer was Simon Phillips, and Simon Phillips is a monster. He's a monster on drums. He can play anything. He prefers to play actually straight ahead rock, but he can do anything. So they reached out to Simon. He was in England. He came over to America, and they did the tour. Then they decided to do another album and make him a full member, which was Tambu. At that point, Toto really was stripped down to Steve Lukather, David Page, Mike Porcaro on bass, and Simon Phillip on drums. And they wrote most of Tambu together and co-produced it with Elliot Schneider. So the feel was different. It's a little bit more stripped back than their prior work, and it was really a core band of four people. Just like the prior album, Kingdom of Desire was really a four-piece, and it was a harder rocking band. By then, of course, Steve Porcaro was gone.
And Bobby Kimball is back in the band in 1998. He stays with the band up until 2008. He's on 1999's album Minefields, which you say the book is occasionally brilliant, yet overly long. He's back on 2002's Through the Looking Glass. an album of covers. Very interesting. They cover Bob Marley's Could You Be Loved, Steely Dan's Bodhisattva, The Beatles' While My Guitar Gently Weeps, The Temptations' I Can't Get Next to You, Stevie Wonder's Living for the City, Herbie Hancock's Maiden Voyage, Elton John's Burn Down the Mission, which is cool, Cream's Sunshine of Your Love, House of the Rising Sun, a traditional song made famous by the Animals, Elvis Costello's Watching the Detectives, and Bob Dylan's It Takes a Lot to Laugh, It Takes a Train to Cry. Tell us why your personal favorite pick is Bodhisattva.
I mean, could you be love is great. Burn Down the Mission, Elton John song.
Love it.
Paige
Yeah.
loves that stuff, and it sounds great. But yeah, I would say probably yeah, Bodhisattva by far is my favorite here, and mostly because not only I mean the guitar parts are great by Lukather, but Simon Phillips drumming throughout this album and his tenure is fantastic. And he's not trying to play Jeff Porcaro. He's not trying to play John Robinson or Carlos Vega, drummers like that. He's Simon Phillips, so he has a stamp on everything he plays. Yeah, it's an interesting album.
The last album to feature Bobby Kimball is 2006's Falling in Between, and the infighting over money and substance abuse by Bobby would return, so he's out of the band again. Let It Go, your personal pick from that album, by the way. Can't argue with that one. Toto 14 came out in 2015, which marked the return of Joseph Williams on lead vocals. Also returning are Steve Porcaro on keyboards and vocals, along with original bassist David Hungate. Sadly, bassist Mike Porcaro passed away in '07 due to ALS. 2018, the band released Old Is New. That was part of the band's All In 1978 to 2018 box set, released separately in 2020. This may be the last batch of new Toto music. If it is, nice way to finish out the catalog, in your opinion?
I'll say this. I hope they don't do new albums. Because I don't see a reason why they would. Total 14 could have been a great album. There were some great songs on it. I wasn't a huge fan of the production, which shouldn't say that since I know the producer. But I thought it was a little too sterile, but the songs were strong. And then Old is New, which is a combination of old songs, unfinished recordings, which were finished by the band, was absolutely remarkable, except for the last song. So I thought it was a great way to end their recording career. The thing you have with Toto, like you have with a lot of bands, is okay, they stopped doing music together, but they're still doing music separately. And I think since Old is New, we've had two or three Steve Lukather solo albums, strong. You had a David Page solo EP, very strong. You have a Steve Porcaro solo album, which is extremely strong. And then Steve Porcaro wrote me last week and said he just finished his latest album. Doesn't have a name yet, but he's finished his second album. So you have great music, which is almost Toto, but not quite Toto. I like the legacy they establish, ending it with Old is New.
So at the end of the book are interviews you did with Steve Porcaro, David Page, Steve Lukather, some great in-depth discussions, and you discovered through talking with Steve Lukather that he has no desire to stop. In fact, you mentioned to him how he's busier than he's ever been. Toto currently touring. It doesn't seem as if Toto is close to ending. Is that the feeling that you get?
That's the feeling I get that he will continue to do it for as long as he can. And the roster will continue to change. I mean, right now they're touring, and they brought back in Greg Fillinganes, who was in the Falling in Between album, to handle some of the keyboards and some of the vocals. And of course, you have Williams there. Then you have a lot of other players who've been with them on and off for a while. So I don't think that the music of Toto will die. They will continue to tour, and they have they've been more popular on the road in America than they probably ever have been, which is weird. Who would have thought? I would imagine that as long as Lukather is around, that Toto will continue, and he will continue to do solo work, but he doesn't tour solo anymore. I saw him solo once in a small club in Illinois, but Toto is the moneymaker. That's what his legacy. He put all those years in it and wants to continue.
Thanks so much, Preston. I enjoyed this. The book is out now. Toto, the band, not the dog. People can find that anywhere you get your books on Amazon. You can find it there. And where can people find you, Preston, online? You have a podcast, right?
Yes, it's called the Slang of Ages podcast. So if you're a Steely Dan fan, you know where Slang of Ages comes from. And my website is slangofages.com. I can be reached at slangofages at me.com. And I really appreciate the conversation.